The yard smelled of salt, oil, and old coffee. Ships sat like tired beasts on the slips. Many said they were finished. Paperwork called them losses. Insurance lists read like goodbyes. The Navy had marked most hulls for scrap. They were ships with names and dents and history, but everyone else had decided they were dead. Armin did not see dead ships. He saw plates and bolts, wires, and memories. He had fixed small things all his life: radios that would not speak, engines that coughed once and then worked, a child's toy that someone else said could not be mended. He walked the dock with a sandwich and a stubbornness that did not quit. When he read the list of lost ships, he laughed softly. Lost is only a word, he told a rusted ladder. The ladder did not answer, but the night did. At 9 in the evening a message came in that changed everything. The nearby port sent an emergency call. A convoy of refugees could leave in 12 hours, if at least a handful of fighters could escort them through a dangerous channel. If the ships did not move, people would be left behind. The Navy said they had 2 operational escorts and that was all. Command wanted to scrap the rest, sell the metal and close the slips. Armin could not watch that happen. He found a man with a soldering iron, a woman who could read wiring diagrams from memory, and 2 young players who knew more about simulators than many old pilots. He knocked on the door of the small repair bay and told them plainly, "We will try." The team that answered was not a proper crew. Shipwrights came with stained hands. A cook who could weld brought a box of spare parts and a thermos of hot tea. An old radio operator showed up with a cartridge of tapes. Even a retired teacher offered to hold a flashlight and promise good words. They had nothing like a Navy budget. They had hands, tools, and a plan that was more hope than paper. They worked like a clock that did not want to stop. The hangar lit up with phone torches and oil lamps. Someone ran a string of LED lights across a beam and said it was the war room. The team divided tasks quick as breath. One group sorted parts from crates stamped salvage. Another group crawled into the belly of a frigate to find a dead console that only needed a new relay. A third group practiced codes to let old ship ace accept patched inputs. At first it felt like a game. Then the night tested them. Sparks flew when a solder joint failed and sprayed a shower of tiny, bright pain. A hydraulic line burst and flooded a lower deck in cold water. Men cursed and worked their gloves under the pressure of a clock. An old mechanic fell asleep sitting up and woke with his head on his crossed arms, sweat and salt on his brow. The team did not stop. They used what they had in ways no manual would teach. A pilot console had a broken display. They fitted it with a tablet from a broken drone. A fuel injector needed a special seal. The cook made a seal from a kitchen gasket and a strip of cloth, and the injector fit like it had always belonged. A radar dish was out of alignment. Kids from a nearby community center climbed the scaffolding and sang as they balanced the plate, and when the dish found a clean return, everyone laughed like a small victory. Suspense tightened when a senior officer came to close the yard. He wore a crisp uniform and a face that decided things quickly. He walked the rows and found a line of people working in the dark. He expected chaos, but he saw order. He stood and watched while a patched engine coughed into life. The officer's jaw tightened. He was not unkind, but he did not smile. Still, he left without shutting them down. That small mercy felt like a gift. Time moved like a slow tide. The clock counted down toward the convoy's window. The team checked, rechecked, and tested. They had one rule: no perfect ship, only safe ship. Armin said it plain. "We do not have time for perfect," he told them. "We have time to be enough." The first patched ship rolled to the slip and thrummed under a borrowed and patched core. People gathered, heads bent, hands steady. When the engine turned steady and lights returned on the bridge, a cheer rose from the hangar that threw bright sound into the night. It was not the cheer of victory so much as the cheer of the small things that mean life. One by one the ships that should have been scrap woke. Panels hummed, pumps coughed, and one old destroyer that had not sailed in years started with a roar like a remembered song. The ragged fleet did not look clean. Paint flaked in places and fresh welds showed like scars. Parts mismatched like old quilts. But the ships moved. The final test came before dawn. The port commander scanned the harbor and then opened a communication channel. "Port to Armada," the message said. The voice that answered came tinny and warm, a voice from patched speakers and tired lungs. "We are ready. We will escort." At sunrise the Armada slid into the water and lifted its lamps. They were not polished trophies. They smelled of coffee and solder and late-night sweat. They sailed in a loose line that looked more like a family crossing than a military parade. The refugee convoy crept out under their care, and the patched escorts moved to meet the dark at the edge of the channel. People on the docks watched until the Armada was a string of lights on the sea. Phones buzzed with messages. A city woke with the small news that, somehow, a fleet had been fixed in one night. Some called it crazy. Some called it miracle. Armin stood with his hands in his pockets and felt the small pride of people who had done what they could. The Duct-Tape Armada sailed, and behind it went Hope, thin, stubborn, and steady as a repaired wire. The fixer smelled of oil and hot metal. It sat quiet in the middle of the yard, a converted freighter full of tools and lamps. People called it the Armada's heart. When ships broke, the fixer's crew ran to it. They patched tanks, rewired consoles, and made engines sing again. Navid lived aboard the fixer. He was young and quick with code. He could make old flight systems listen to new commands. Salma was older. She read stars the way others read maps. She could find a lost bearing by the scratch on a hull. They worked in shifts while the rest of the Armada sailed slow and steady. The night began cold. A star road showed only half its lights. The convoy lay like a raised chest behind a thin shield. Refugees waited with tired eyes. The fixer's team moved like a small, practiced crew. They had no real plan for everything. They had tricks, habits, and a stubborn heart. At midnight an escort's call came in. Its power loop had failed deep under the waves. The ship drifted, lights dead, engines coughing salt. If the escort could not move, the convoy would slow and lose its safe window. Navid packed a small team and a box of parts. They left the fixer in a rough launch and cut through water that smelled like rain on metal. When they arrived, the escort was darker than they expected. Flood lamps blinked and then died. Men climbed the outer ladders with ropes and flashlights. In the engine room, steam hissed from a broken relay that fed the main bus. No spare fit. The ship's hull groaned under the stress. Salma climbed through a hatch and found a dusty crate. "Old parts keep old ships alive," she said with a small laugh. She pulled out a worn rotor from a museum stock. Its teeth showed age, but it still had honesty. The team worked fast. They soldered and sealed, and when the relay clicked back, the lights returned like someone opening a window to morning. The escort gave a low, happy cough. The team cheered and clapped each other with wet gloves. Not all fixes were metal. A child's toy fell down a ladder into the water and made a young mechanic freeze. The toy was stamped with the name Maya. For a moment the crew forgot the engines. Someone remembered a daughter at home, someone else a lost niece. An older sailor dove and fished the toy from the dark. He handed it back with a smile that trembled. The small thing tied them to the reason they risked nights like this. Word of the fixer moved fast. Fishermen who knew how to bend propellers walked through the gate with lamps. A retired welder came and set up beside a table with a spool of wire. A robotics club brought a box of servos and a welding torch. No one asked for money. They wanted to help. Volunteers changed the work. A team of children from a community center climbed scaffolds and hummed as they balanced a radar dish into alignment. Their voices made the work light. A woman who cooked in the port galley set up a kettle and fed the crew between shifts. Her stews kept fingers warm and minds sharp. But nights at sea are not only small kindnesses. Pirates patrolled channels like sores. The Armada learned new tricks to hide. Reflectors and old plates made ships look like junk to cameras. Mirrors placed just right bent radar into useless data. The fixer's crew built a fog machine from an old refinery pump and a load of cloth. The smoke smelled of burned diesel and scared away sensors. They made lies that looked like truth and truth that looked like ruin to any saw-toothed scanner. One night the tricks faced a real test. A pirate cutter ambushed them at a narrow pass. It fired a warning shot that splattered water like angry beads. The escort nearest the ambush took a mine blast that cracked a hull. Water poured in with the sound of a small river. Alarms screamed and men shouted orders. The team moved like a well-drilled band. Mechanics hooked a salvage pump and tied net lines. They used an improvised patch of rubber and clamps to stop the flood. A baker who had become a diver in the Armada slipped under and sealed the leak with resin and cloth. Men worked with knives and prayers. When the hole held, the ship did not sink. The convoy kept moving. After that night, stories spread. The fixer stitched images together into legend. A patched radar that once meant doom now showed hope. Women whose husbands had been sailors told neighbors the tale. People began to call the Armada not a pile of scrap but a moving school for the brave. Yet repair on the move came with hard choices. The crew had to choose which ship to fix first, who to leave with less, and how to share fuel between a damaged cruiser and a sick freighter with children aboard. Temper rose like steam in small rooms. Food was short. A fight over meal rations nearly broke into fists. Armin walked into that kitchen and talked plain and simple. He reminded them about the children, the convoy, and the names carved into a rusted panel. He spoke like a captain of no rank but much heart. People listened. In the hours before dawn, the fixer's team pulled a miracle. A key sensor had burned out on a lead escort, a small part that cost more than a month's wages. Navid took 2 old drone controllers and rewired them into a sensor proxy. It was not perfect, but it worked. The escort could see the pass. The convoy could move. When sun rose, the Armada looked different. It was not sleek. Its hulls were patched like quilts, painted in different hands. It smelled of coffee and hot metal, of stories and late-night songs. The convoy moved through the morning with its ragged protectors, and people on shore watched in wonder. The fixer did more than fix machines that night. It built a web of people who could do more than survive. It taught that many small hands, clever tricks, and stubborn hearts could keep hope afloat. The Armada moved on, but its legend grew. Somewhere ahead lay a narrow canyon and a storm. The fixer's crew knew this. They had learned how to make life when the world said the ships were dead. They also knew the next test would need more than patchwork. It would need courage that did not end with dawn. The Armada had a shape now. It moved like a living thing. But the world did not only cheer. Some saw profit. Some saw a chance to stop them. At the channel called the Narrows, a militia set up a toll. They put old guns on rock outcrops and wired small mines to a crude sensor field. They wanted money and control. The militia commander sent a message: pay the toll, or turn back. The Armada had no money. It had patched engines and a long thin hope. Armin and the fixer crew watched the channel on a cracked screen. They saw the militia boats crouch in the fog like bad teeth. The convoy could try to run in the open sea, but the route would take them far and cost fuel the Armada did not have. The other route was the Narrows, faster, but a trap. The choice felt like a trap itself. What do we have? Navid asked. His fingers tapped a rhythm on the table. He liked games and now life felt like one. Salma opened a battered notebook and pointed to the map. We can make them see more than we are, she said. We can make a shadow fleet. They planned a bluff. The fixer crew worked like theater builders. They fixed old drones and painted them with mirrors. They rigged extra lights to flicker in patterns that made radar think there were more hulls. They built loud sirens on skiffs and ran fake comms that said the Armada had heavy guns. They practiced timing so shadows and lights would match. The world had more fear than metal. They would use that. On the night they moved, fog lay low like a blanket. The militia waited with flashlights and a hard hope. The Armada slid into the fog and became a band of shapes. Drones flew false hulls above, their light trails making long bright lines. Mirrors bent the radar returns into false mass. Sirens made a chorus that sounded like a fleet returning from war. The militia fired at shapes. A missile struck at a reflected light and left the sea steaming. Men shouted and hit switches. For a moment the bluff worked. The militia hesitated. It was all theater and cunning. Then the real danger arrived. A drifting mine sat where no one had seen it. It hit the lead escort with a terrible burst. The hull cracked. Steel gave with the wet scream of a wound. Water rushed like a small flood. Alarms screamed and men moved with practiced fear. The fixer responded without words. Mechanics hooked salvage pumps. Divers slid into water that smelled of fuel and copper. A baker turned diver, a man named Kabir, dove to find the breach. He moved slow and sure under pressure. He planted a rubber sheet and tied clamps with hands that did not tremble. For a time everyone watched without breath, as if they should not dare to hope. The patch held. The hull stopped drinking the sea. But Kabir did not come up the same. He had a cut on his arm. The water had been cold and the metal rough. His breathing came heavy on the stretch back to the fixer. Doctors wrapped his arm and spoke in low voices. He smiled weak and joked about bread and salt. The crew felt the cost of the bluff. They had beaten fear with cleverness, but the price had been flesh. The convoy passed the Narrows by the skin of its luck and the grit of repaired pumps. People cheered as lights vanished into safer waters. The militia grumbled, but they had no will to chase. For a moment the Armada felt like it had won. That victory did not last long. The fixer needed a major part, a rotor from a heavy generator. Without it, the fixer could not run more than 2 engines at once. Without the engines, the Armada could not hold formation. The old shipyard on Dead Man Reef had the rotor on a shelf. But Dead Man Reef was a graveyard of ships. Old automatics still patrolled. Salvage crawlers snapped like steel spiders. The raid would be dangerous. Armin called a meeting in a tent lit by a single lamp. Faces circled the map. People were tired and some were angry. Food was short. Many wanted rest. The fixer could not stop. The refugees needed a protective screen for another day. They must risk the shipyard. They planned the raid the way a thief plans a heist. Quiet teams would slip in under dawn. Divers would cut the pilot cones. A small boarding party would ride a tethered skiff to the shelf where the rotor sat. Naveed rewrote an old drone control so a salvage arm would open a maintenance hatch. They practiced the timing until everyone knew the sound of the next step. At first, the shipyard looked like sleeping junk. Old hulls leaned like tired beasts. But the automatics woke like worms when lights moved. The team moved slow. A false shadow drone drew a patrol east. A small skiff slipped through a gap in rusted plates. The boarding party climbed to the shelf with tools taped to vests. The rotor waited behind a rusted locker, heavy as a promise. Then a cleaning drone found them. Its claws clicked and it barked a warning in a sound like a saw. The team froze. A wrong move and the automatics would call more. Armin did a quiet thing. He took a strip of tarp and held it out like a flag. It made a shadow in the drone's sensor. The drone paused, as if confused by a ghost. The team moved. They grabbed the rotor and ran. A siren woke the yard like an angry animal. Hunters came at them with nets and metal teeth. The skiff roared away with the rotor lashed to its deck. Bullets cut water and sparks flew. A net snagged a wing. A drone clipped a cable. The skiff tilted and took on water. Naveed worked the controls with hands that shook. He cut lines, rerouted power, and prayed in code. The team reached the nebulous edge where the fixer lay and surged in. A last cleaning drone tried to bite the skiff's tail and lost its claw in the net. The skiff limped to the fixer and the crew heaved the heavy rotor aboard. Exhaustion and joy mixed like oil and water. Back on the fixer, Hans built a new rotor with love and math. They fitted it to the generator and the machine breathed again. The Armada could hold formation. But the raid left scars. Kabir's cut grew infected and he slept deep with fever. Someone had a limp from a rope burn. A young coder cried in a corner because he had seen a child's photo in a broken console and knew he could not fix all the broken things in the world. The crew gathered and counted cost. They had taken a dangerous thing back to life. They had lied with lights and stolen parts from a graveyard. The Armada moved on, but the night's raid left the team with a hard question: was saving many worth the danger to a few? They had answers in their hands and questions in their chests. Ahead lay the final leg, a storm canyon that would test every patched hull and every stubborn heart. The Armada kept moving, but it felt thin now. The fixer had pulled a heavy rotor from a wreck, and the generator hummed new life. Still, every ship had a small wound. Fuel ran low. Food ran low. Men and women worked with fingers that hurt. The fleet needed a steady heart, one generator to hold formation and one plan to keep them all alive. Naveed and Salma slept little. They turned parts and notes under a dim lamp while others snored in tarps. The rotor fit the old generator, but the machine wanted more than metal, it wanted balance. A rotor tooth had a hairline crack. The whole engine would shake and die if it ran too long. They could machine a new tooth, but the yard they needed was 2 days away. 2 days the convoy did not have. They had a choice: wait and risk the convoy, or make a new part from what they had. They chose to try. Temperatures and tides would not be polite. They were not mechanical saints. They had a plan of cheap parts, a lot of hope, and no guarantee. In a tent that smelled of grease and tea, the team laid pieces on a table. Armin traced a line and said, "We make it work. We do not make it pretty." Laughter came because fear drinks better with a small joke. The crew sliced, bent, and welded. They hammered a shaft until the metal sang. A child who traveled with the convoy brought a broken toy motor and handed it to Naveed. "Maybe this helps," she said with eyes that had seen too much. The toy motor fit a small gap like a tiny key. Naveed wrapped it with wire, balanced it with washers, and then held his breath. The generator turned. It coughed and then steadied. The team cheered, their voices cracked with tired joy. The fixer had a heartbeat again. Outside, the sea changed its mood. Dark clouds rolled like old wool. The weather reports what little they had said: a storm would meet them in the canyon. The canyon was a narrow cut between cliffs where waves bounced and ships liked to play cruel games. To cross it, pilots needed steady instruments and an engine that would not sing wrong. The patched fleet had both now, barely. Tension moved through the Armada like a current. Food lines grew long. A small fight broke over a hot ration. 2 men argued and hands rose. For a moment it felt like the whole effort could fray because of anger and tiredness. Armin walked into the mess and did something he had done from the first night: he listened. He did not shout. He asked the men about their families, the names carved on bulkheads, the small things that kept them going. He spoke plain. He told them the convoy had children who would sleep tonight because of their hands. He said he could not promise glory, only work that mattered. The men lowered their voices. Anger turned into hard faces and then into nods. The small talk smoothed a small wound. When the storm hit, the sky moved fast. Rain came like a thrown blanket. Wind pinned waves high and low. The canyon channeled the whole ocean's temper. Pilots strapped in. The lead escort ran a steady beat on the comms: "Short, clear, and warm. The patched NAV rigs wavered. The fixer's new generator kept them powered, but the Kenyan made sailors old again. They entered in a line like mothers and children walking through a narrow street. Every pilot watched the wake of the ship ahead. Naveed called distances in simple counts. Salma read the stars hidden behind clouds and whispered corrections. The Kenyan tested them with sideways gusts that pushed the bow and tried to make a ship's tail hit a rock. A wrong turn would rip plates and spill people to the sea. Halfway through, the lead escort rolled into a trough and a gust slammed a patched hull. A welded seam snapped with a sound like a long sigh. The ship lurched and lost alignment. For a terrible second, the convoy's path tilted toward a jagged rock. Hands moved. A small skiff dove out from the fixer and ran a web of temporary guide cables. Mechanics climbed the tilting shell and lashed the seam. A diver tied a clamp with cold and steady hands while others held lines. The world narrowed to glue and wire and breath. The patched crew did not stop to think of glory. They acted because someone's child slept below. The seam held. The convoy righted. Engines roared and lights blinked. The Kenyan spat them out into calmer water like a bearded gatekeeper who finally let them pass. People on the decks wept, laughed, and shouted. The Armada had one passage, but the cost showed in scraped hands and a man who would not stop coughing for days. At the next calm port, the Armada found a friendly quay. People with warm blankets waited. Mothers hugged children. The fixer's crew unloaded a list of small miracles, engines that now ran, sensors that saw, a school of patched radios that chimed. The refugees stepped onto steady ground and held it like a new truth. The Armada did not end at that quay. News of the patched fleet spread. Some called them vigilantes. Some called them thieves. Others called them saints. A private firm offered money and uniforms. Armin and his team listened, but they had already learned what they wanted. They had seen how small hands and stubborn minds could save many. They had watched a convoy move because a toy motor fit a broken space. That night, under lamps that smelled of tea, the crew counted cost. Kabir's cut had healed enough to joke. The young coder who had cried was given a place to teach children to solder. People patched more than metal, they rebuilt trust. The fixer hummed like a tired heart that had been mended. As the stars came out, Armin stood at the rail and watched the Armada's lights blink like slow pulses in the dark. He thought of the many small hands that had kept the fleet alive. He did not know if the world would always help the next time. He only knew one fact clean as a star: people who fix things can save lives. The Armada's heartbeat kept time, and the convoy moved into a morning that smelled of bread and small, steady hope. The quay smelled of wet wood and fresh bread. People who had been afraid weeks before now moved slowly, as if the ground itself had changed under their feet. Children ran with new shoes. Mothers sat on steps and cried quietly. The refugees hugged each other and looked at the shore like it was a small miracle. Armin stood with the fixer crew and watched the convoy unload. He felt tired in his bones and light in his chest. The Armada had done what people said was impossible. Ships that were dead had carried children to safety. Men who had no title had become keepers of lives. Armin thought of the nights in the hangar, the solder sparks, and the smell of tea. That smell was now the smell of home. News vans came. Cameras followed the fixer crew as if they were heroes on a stage. Some reporters asked about bravery. Others asked about law. A company with a polished name sent a lawyer and a polite letter. They claimed a right to one of the algorithms. Naveed had made the code that let old navs accept patched inputs. The company wanted money and a license. Naveed read the letter in a small tent and felt a cold spike of anger. The crew argued. Some wanted to sell the code and buy parts that would never break again. Others feared being used by profit. Armin held a simple vote in the mess hall. His hand did not tremble. We fixed ships to save people, he said. We will not sell safety to the highest bidder. They chose a different path. The fixers would be a collective. They would share their fixes for free. They would teach anyone who wanted to learn. They wrote a short pledge on a scrap of metal: help first, profit never, teach always. They stapled it to the fixer's bulkhead like a small, stubborn flag. That decision made enemies and friends. The polished company went to court. The case was messy and loud. The fixers did not have deep pockets, but they had something else: people. Volunteers streamed lessons online. Fishermen, students, and retired mechanics watched and learned. In 1 week, the code the company wanted was on thousands of small chips sold cheaply in markets. The company could not lock what the world had found. The legal fight ended with the firm backing down. The fixers had not only won a case, they had moved a culture. Ports began to set up community parts stores. People learned to carry a common wrench and a spare tube. Schools opened where soldering irons were as normal as pencils. Small towns that had once sent young men to big factories now kept them at home as fixers. The fixer became a mobile school. Volunteers taught in parks and docks. Salma ran night classes on reading old hull marks and predicting failures. Naveed ran workshops where kids learned to make simple flight code. Jora, a sound woman everyone trusted, taught calm, how to keep hands steady when a pump dies and a child cries. The group taught not only skill but rules: never take a war job, always help civilians, and never hide a danger behind pride. Governments noticed. Some offered money. Some offered medals. Armin took food and rejected a uniform. He wanted no badge that would turn the fixers into tools of power. He wanted a plaque on the quay that listed names of those saved and a yearly watch where people would clean the docks and remind each other of what they did. The city put up a small brass plate with a simple line: built by hands that would not leave. Not all stories turned gentle. A small group still tried to sell harsh fixes. A private security firm asked the fixers to make stronger hulls for money. The fixers refused. They had learned the hard way that sometimes a good fix in the wrong hands becomes a weapon. They had seen a patched ship used to block a canal for ransom. They chose to teach and to guard, not to arm. Years passed. The Armada scattered and mended. Some ships were returned to old fleets as working vessels. Others became trading ships that carried grain instead of guns. Ports learned to share parts. A network of small repair hubs grew across coasts and inner seas. People who had once called the fixers fools now asked for lessons on how to keep their town afloat in a crisis. Small rituals grew too. Every year on the day the convoy reached shore, people lit small lamps along the quay. They ate simple bread and remembered names. Children played with toy ships made from scrap and learned to solder a wire. The fixers taught them gentle tasks: how to find a broken solder joint, how to read a worn serial, how to sew a fuel seal that would not leak. The world learned that craft and kindness were a kind of defense. In a quiet moment, Armin walked the quay late and found a small group of newcomers learning to solder. A child struggled with a steady hand. An older woman reached over and guided the child's fingers. The moment felt like many of the nights in the hangar, only softer. Armin smiled and thought of the long line of hands that had kept the fleet alive. The final scene is small and true. A rebuilt ship, once called the Old Sparrow, now painted in many colors, sets out with books, teachers, and a small medical team. Children wave from its deck. The fixer's flag flaps in a gentle wind. Armin stands at the rail and holds a dented toy the child gave him at the quay. He passes it to a young volunteer who will teach the next class how to fix radios. The last line is spoken like a vow: we fix, we teach, we stay. The ship moves toward sunrise. The sea takes the Armada's light and carries it, like a promise, into a new day.